Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to unravel a genuine mystery, the deep, step-by-step genetic history of the Appalachian Mountains. We're looking at a region that's famous for a very specific, almost legendary cultural identity. But, we're going to look right past the history books today and peer directly into the genetic code. And what we find is a fascinating story of movement, survival, and mixture that completely rewrites a century-old narrative. Let's get right into it. Okay, let's just dive in and start with the central question that most Americans think they already know the answer to. I mean, ask almost anyone where Appalachian people come from, and the answer comes back instantly. Scotland and Ireland. We immediately picture fiddles, very specific surnames carried deep into mountain hollows, and this perfectly preserved British heritage. It sounds clean, right? It sounds settled. And it's a story that has been repeated for well over a century. But here is where we have to contrast that clean, familiar story of Scots-Irish mountaineers with the much stranger, kind of messy truth that modern DNA actually reveals. The popular myth focuses heavily on purity and isolation. The genetic reality, however, exposes a beautifully complex history of multiple convergences. Now, the familiar answer isn't exactly wrong, but it's just the very last layer of a much older story. So let's peel those layers back, step by step, starting from the very beginning. To truly understand this, we must look at the Appalachian Mountains not just as a location on a map, but as an ancient geological container. I mean, these mountains are so old, they formed before Pangaea even broke apart. That's before the Atlantic Ocean existed. They are this massive series of overlapping ridges, deep valleys, and incredibly dense forests. Geography is literally everything here. It acted as an ancient genetic filter, first making movement incredibly slow, then allowing only certain bloodlines in, keeping others contained, and ultimately preserving genetic patterns step by step that would have completely vanished anywhere else. So we begin with the very first indigenous layer. Long before a single European boot ever touched the soil, these mountains were home to indigenous peoples. Down in the southern mountains, the Cherokee had established really deep roots by around 1000 CE. We're talking about a thriving pre-contact population of tens of thousands who built vast trading networks, towns, and advanced agricultural systems. And of course, this civilization was later devastated by European diseases and forced displacements, most notably the brutal Indian Removal Act of 1830. Now, this early history brings up something super fascinating that geneticists call the Cherokee syndrome. Millions of Americans claim Cherokee ancestry as part of their family lore, but consumer genetic testing actually struggles to confirm this ancient admixture. Why is that? Well, because these consumer tools just aren't great at detecting tiny amounts of DNA from so many generations back. But honestly, more importantly, it highlights how our national mythology sort of tries to handle the vast, uncomfortable absence left by the forced removal of indigenous peoples. Moving step by step forward into the 1720s and 30s, we start to uncover the actively erased footprints of European settlers. Palatine Germans were actually among the earliest and most numerous pioneer groups to clear and farm Appalachian land, yet you almost never hear about them. Why? Because in the 20th century, ethnographers and folklorists quite literally wrote them out of the record. Following the two world wars, there was this massive anti-German sentiment, which led historians to push a pure British stock narrative. They just completely absorbed the German contribution into a story that had absolutely no room for them. And that brings us to a wildly surprising statistic: 10. By the year 1790, roughly 10% of the Appalachian population was African American. This included both enslaved individuals, who were held by white settlers, and notably by some Cherokee as well, and also free people of color. Look, this is a massive hidden layer of Appalachian history, and it deeply shaped the iconic Appalachian way of life. First off, the banjo, that arrived with West African origins. Then it met Celtic fiddle traditions right there in the very same mountain communities. Over time, that beautiful, spontaneous fusion evolved into what we now know as bluegrass music. And after the Civil War, many freed African Americans established completely self-sustaining agricultural communities, fundamentally shaping the region, even while later historians clearly preferred to just write a simple, single origin story. So this whole dynamic is captured perfectly in a historical saying that researchers have noted: "You turned white when you moved west." This simple phrase speaks volumes. It points out exactly how fluid and, honestly, how dangerous identity could be back then. And it leads us directly to the absolute most dramatic case of hidden ancestry in the entire Appalachian region. Deep in the hollows, there were these communities who just didn't fit into simple racial categories, historically known as Melungeons. They were dark-skinned, sometimes with striking blue or green eyes. And you have to remember, under the brutal racial laws of the 18th and 19th centuries, being classified as African American meant losing your land, your voting rights, and very potentially your actual freedom. So these isolated families did what they literally had to do to survive. They constructed exotic origin stories. They claimed to be Portuguese, Turkish, or purely Native American. They built these elaborate myths simply to stay safe in a legal system that was entirely rigged against them. And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer power of modern genetics. The DNA remembered what the documents actively tried to erase. A peer-reviewed study using autosomal DNA, which traces all of your ancestral lines, exposed the true genetic roots of the Melungeon core families. It revealed they primarily carry sub-Saharan African paternal lineages and European maternal lineages, with Native American ancestry appearing later on. It is such a stunning window into how people alter their reported history to survive, while their genes just quietly hold on to the truth. Okay, stepping forward again in our timeline, starting roughly around the 1710s, we finally see the dominant cultural footprint arrive, the Ulster Scots, or what we call the Scotch-Irish. First, they traveled across the Atlantic, mostly landing in Pennsylvania. Then, step by step, they moved south along the Great Wagon Road. And they brought with them the Presbyterian faith, those lowland Scots dialects, and this fierce, hardened frontier sensibility. Their cultural imprint was massive, it was incredibly real, and you can still hear it audibly in the region today. But remember, if we look through our genetic lens, even the beloved Scots-Irish weren't a pure biological unit to begin with. The term itself describes a migration route and a shared culture. Genetically speaking, they were already a deeply layered mixture of Norse coastal settlements, pre-Roman Celtic populations, and early medieval Anglo-Saxon migrations. Long before they ever set foot in Northern Ireland, there was no single pure ancestral source. Now let's step into the late 19th century and watch how this all completely shifts. In the 1880s, the mass extraction of timber and coal transformed the demographic landscape almost overnight. Giant corporations basically stripped the mountains, and entirely new populations flooded into the mining camps. This brought Welsh miners for their deep metallurgical expertise, Eastern European immigrants desperate for work, and large numbers of newly freed African Americans looking for a fresh start. Just to give you a sense of scale regarding this industrial explosion, the population of the Central Plateau increased a staggering six-fold in just 40 years. That ancient genetic container of the mountains was suddenly flooded with completely new inputs. Yet, right outside those booming coal camps, deep geographic isolation was doing something completely fascinating to the genetics of the early pioneer families. Let's walk step by step through what geneticists call the founder effect. Step 1. A small founding family settles into a deep mountain valley with extremely limited outside contact. Step 2. For generations, people mostly marry within that small, isolated community. And step 3. Their specific genetic patterns naturally amplify in their descendants, to the point where certain recessive genetic conditions appear at vastly elevated rates today. The mountains essentially locked their DNA in place. So what does this all mean? Well, it means that Appalachia spans far too much geography and complex history to be considered one single population. Genetically, it's actually divided into 3 distinct sections. The northern section carried heavy German and English settlement, mixed later with Welsh and Eastern European industrial workers. The central section is where that isolated founder effect we just talked about was the strongest. And the southern section? That's the Cherokee homeland, the Melungeon zone, and it holds a much stronger African American presence. When we step back and really look at the iconic symbols of the region, we see so many erased contributions. I mean, the famous Appalachian log cabin, researchers trace that not to British settlers, but to early Swedish and Finnish woodsmen. Add in Welsh metallurgy, German farming techniques, and the fact that European settlers were literally walking on ancient Cherokee trails as if they had always been there, and you start to see how much of the true step-by-step story didn't make it into the popular mythology. So the grand takeaway here is convergence, not purity. Autosomal DNA perfectly captures the accumulated result of all these events, generations of mixture, movement, and survival. It proves the region is a beautiful, wildly complex convergence forged into a recognizable identity. Scots-Irish culture was absolutely real, but so was the indigenous world, the African ancestry, the German farmers, and the diverse coal camp migrants. DNA doesn't ruin the mystery of Appalachia at all. Honestly, it makes it vastly more profoundly interesting and human. And that leaves us with a pretty provocative final thought to ponder. If these mountains can hold the genetic memory of everyone who ever crossed them, surviving despite laws, myths, and deliberate omissions. What does your own DNA remember that historical documents tried to erase? Think about that as you reflect on